Hello and welcome to another lecture of Econ 2301, Principles of Macroeconomics. This lecture will cover Chapter 10 of your book, which goes over fiscal policy and how we can use fiscal policy to stabilize the economy. So before we begin, what exactly is fiscal policy? Well, we define in economics fiscal policy as changes in government taxes and spending that affect the level of GDP. What is the role of fiscal policy, specifically when we're talking about aggregate demand? Well, there are two ways in which we use fiscal policy. The first is expansionary, and expansionary shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right, and contractionary, which shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left. Expansionary policies are ones in which the government increases aggregate demand. Contractionary policies are ones in which the government decreases aggregate demand. And you might be asking yourself, why would we want to decrease aggregate demand? Well, essentially what we're trying to do is keep the economy from growing too fast, which creates bubbles, similar to the one that we experienced recently, the housing bubble. We want it to not grow so fast that we have this inflated market that leads to price levels that are not at equilibrium. And when prices adjust back after the equilibrium or down to the equilibrium point, we have this gap, and that leads to a decrease in real income, which leads to the exact opposite of the wealth effect. It's almost an adverse wealth effect, and people don't have as much money. And we can also see things like hyperinflation exist in economies that grow almost too fast that are not stable. The fiscal multiplier needs to be accounted for when talking about the contractionary and expansionary methods. And when we develop policy, we take this into account. We know that because of the multiplier, we're going to have a greater shift in just the initial impact of a policy on aggregate demand. We also know that the multiplier works through the impact of household income, and therefore consumption will follow an initial shock, and therefore resulting into less spending or more spending continually. What I mean by that, or what the book is talking about when it says that, for instance, if we have a policy that lowers your taxes and you go to Taco Bell and eat, that person at Taco Bell now has more money because you employed them by buying tacos at Taco Bell. That person can now go to Walmart, and vice versa. They just keep going and going and going. Within the multiplier effect, we see money changing hands and growing as it changes hands. What the policymakers need to account for is that there's a ripple effect throughout the economy whenever they make a policy change, specifically when we're talking about household income. Also, we know that the business owners see this as well, and if we have a policy that is such where business owners cannot employ as many people or pay as high of wages, those particular people will not spend as much money or consume as much within the economy, and that almost puts a dead end to the multiplier effect. And whenever the multiplier effect stops, we can see a negative impact that ripples through the economy. So there are limits to stabilization policies. And what are stabilization policies? Stabilization policies are policies that are enacted to move the economy closer to full employment or potential output. If you'll recall, full employment is when employment is at the natural rate of unemployment, or unemployment is at the natural rate of unemployment. That is when we don't have cyclical unemployment, we only have frictional and structural. So why are there limits to stabilization policies? These are policies that we try to keep enacted so the economy doesn't grow too fast, and it also grows when it's contracting. We keep it stabilized without having too big of troughs and peaks. The two things that really affect it are inside lags and outside lags. Inside lags are the time it takes to formulate a policy. If you recall, in Congress right now, it takes a long time for them to pass a bill. From the time it starts being discussed, any type of policy, whether it's a healthcare act, lowering taxes, increasing education, immigration reform, to small business loans. The time it takes from the point in which they talk about it in Congress or any policymaker to the point of the president signing it and it goes into law is called the inside lag. Now, this used to be very short and very efficient because we would only have one session and they would try to get everything done or get it done in that particular session. In today's era, the inside lag is substantial. Outside lags are the actual time it takes for the policy to work. This is the time from when the president signs it into law before that policy has any impact on our economy or specifically GDP. Now, one thing to note with this is the outside lag is very difficult to measure. I've read some economists are predicting the Healthcare Act will take 5 years before we know whether it works or not. This can be very detrimental because what if it's horrific and we need to retract it? Well, it's 5 years before we know whether it's bad or not. What if it's really good and we want to vamp it up? Well, it'll be 5 years before we know or not. And so that's an outside lag. Forecasting uncertainties. One of the problems that makes lags even worse is that economists are not very accurate in forecasting what will happen in the economy. We're kind of like weathermen or women. We really don't have the science down on what's going to happen. And you might be laughing and saying, or you might be crying, saying, why don't you know? Why can't we predict what's going to happen? Well, it's because the economy is constantly changing as well as our world is evolving. You know, the same policies that got us out of the Great Depression won't work today. During the Great Depression, we had a whole half of the labor force that was not skilled and wasn't working. Today, women are close to 50% of the labor force. I mean, they are getting up there, and they're very skilled. They're in education. The majority of students are now female. That doesn't even compare to the 1930s when majority of women were stay-at-home moms. And so to use policies that worked then versus today just doesn't make sense, as well as labor laws. We have more technology today. It wouldn't make any sense to enact labor laws in which we're protecting the low-skilled worker when they're being replaced with robots. And it's very difficult because things are constantly changing within the markets, the way we enact things. A good example of this is farming. It used to be that a farmer would employ their children to work on the farm, and they would pass that farm on down to their children, and everybody would get together and work for harvest. I remember growing up, we would all help out with harvest for my uncle. And today, and that was just 15, 16 years ago, but today, he can do it pretty much himself. He has a semi, he has a combine, and he doesn't really need that much help from me. It used to be that we needed a couple people driving trucks, tractors, all kinds of things. But today, he can actually take his wheat. I grew up in Colorado, and we grew a lot of wheat there. And he can today take his wheat, put it in a grain bin that's on his property, and wait for the price to go up. It used to be that he had to take the wheat that he harvested immediately to the co-op or the elevator and sell his wheat then. He had no choice in the matter. Now, today, with the technology, he even has GPS on his tractor. Sorry I got off subject there, but that kind of shows you how things change and why it's very difficult to predict the outcomes of policies and the way that they'll work, because we can't forecast the economy very well. This graph kind of shows you what we try to do with stabilization policies. We try to get it closer to full employment at the natural rate of unemployment, and by doing so, the impacts of shocks are not as significant on the economy. This is a federal budget, and I'm going to go quickly through this. I've talked about this before in another lecture when I talked about the partial shutdown that we experienced in the government just a month ago. But what you need to know from this is there's really two outlay categories. Those outlay categories are discretionary spending and entitlement and mandatory spending. Every year, Congress must pass a budget, and the ones that they pass or change every year are discretionary spending. This is typically education and defense. Now, the reason why defense is in there and military gets passed every single year is that we don't know whether we're going to be in war or not. Think of it this way. In 1999, our military budget was about half the size of what it is today. In 2002, it went up drastically. Well, that was because of 9/11 and us going to war. We need to adjust that budget as we go to war and peacetime happens, etc., etc. Education. Why would education continually change? Well, there's a couple reasons. The first is because of technology. Technology changes. We need to invest in it. We can't allocate money for typewriters when computers are available. Technology gets better, and we need to continually be on the cutting edge of our education platforms. But also, and more importantly, populations change. They grow, but they also change within various communities. For instance, there are a lot of little towns within West Texas that are shrinking. There are also a lot of growing communities within West Texas. South Lubbock in the Friendship area is growing substantially, and as these various school districts change, we can't allocate the same amount of education spending. For instance, if you had an explosion of students, essentially of populace, increase enrollment, what you're seeing is that the dollar will have to go further unless we increase the expenditure. Whereas if you had enrollment decreasing by 50% and kept education spending at the same rate, that school district would obviously be very happy, but it wouldn't be the most efficient way to utilize our funding. So the entitlements and mandatory spending, that's where our social programs come into place. And the reason why those don't get passed every single year is because if you're on Medicare or Medicaid or retirement, you don't want your paycheck essentially, or your help to be at the hands of the government every single year. You don't want it to come up to October 30th and be fretting whether or not you're going to get your paycheck. Those are guaranteed. You've earned your disability, you've earned your retirement, things like that. Now, we can look at those policies and revamp them, and we continually do, but we don't put them within the spending bill. Those are things that we pass, and we usually pass for a long period of time. The thing that makes me most sad, though, is this other programs. If you look at the bottom right here, within that is Congress and the president's pay. In the event of a shutdown, everything inside of entitlements and mandatory spending will be paid as long as there is revenue to pay that. Also, net interest will be paid. That's the debt we pay. That gets paid first because we don't want to default on our debt. If we defaulted on our debt, our interest rate would go up, and I don't even want to think about that. let's just talk about these other programs right here. So if the other programs, and what I'm talking about is Congress, in the event of a shutdown, they will get paid. And so therefore, Congress gets paid even though your local military personnel won't get paid. Your local educational program might not get paid. It may or may not. These are all discretionary. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress authorizes on an annual basis. Entitlement and mandatory spending, that's spending that Congress has authorized by prior law. This is the support for individuals. Those are transfer payments. Transfer payment essentially is a payment that you don't pay in, but you get. I also like to call those double negatives because you're getting a benefit, but you're not paying into the whole gross revenue or taxes. So federal spending, when we're talking about the mandatory social programs, these are the three categories, the most significant ones. Social Security, that's one that is for retirees. Medicare is for a health program for the elderly. Medicaid is a federal and state program for the poor. And what's really interesting about Medicaid is that it's so inefficient because it has to go through many, many levels. It's federally passed, then it gets sent to the state level, and the states, each 50 states, get to decide how they disperse the Medicaid. Because of that, it doesn't work very well. There are many states that have different laws on the books. One state might be more restrictive, one state might be more liberal, one state might invest more into health education and wellness, one may invest in only treatments. It's just not a good program, and it needs to be looked at, in my own opinion. All right, federal revenues. These are just taxes. We've got to pay our budget somehow, and this is how we do it. The first is income taxes. Income taxes are something that these federal income taxes that come out of your check before you get the check. Usually when you get your paycheck, these are the very first taxes that you'll see, the federal income tax. Depending on your tax rate, this is the amount you will pay the federal government. This is what you pay the IRS. The next are social insurance taxes. Those are things like Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare. Next, you'll see the corporate taxes, and you'll notice those are not really significant. Only $138 billion, or $138 billion, or 1% of GDP. The thing about them is that even though they're only $138 billion, you have to take into account there are not nearly as many businesses as there are people working, and therefore that's a huge amount considering the lack of businesses per people or per consumer. And there are two ways to look at this in the way that Democrats and Republicans approach it. Democrats try to attack the income tax, and Republicans try to attack the business taxes. And what I mean by that is Democrats essentially try to lower these taxes so that you consume more. That's a Keynesian theory. And Republicans, and we'll look at this in just a second, try to lower business taxes, and therefore you will hire more people. And Republicans try to keep these normal and consistent from higher earnings to lower earnings, and Democrats try to raise the taxes on businesses, therefore increasing this or lowering the profit margin of the very wealthy, essentially. Estate, excise, and other taxes, those are just taxes that you incur for various reasons, like selling a car, or for dying, you leave a lot of money to your relatives, friends, family. That's your estate tax. Excise tax, if you give a gift over $10,000 to someone, the person that you gave a gift to has to pay taxes on it. Okay, supply side economics and Laffer Curve. This is where the Republican theory that's most common comes into play. The supporting businesses comes into play. The supply side is a school of thought that emphasizes the role taxes play on the output side of the economy. This is the producer side. Essentially what they believe is that if you lower taxes on businesses, businesses can hire more people, and those people will have a multiplying effect in the economy by purchasing more goods. Similar to the Democrats' theory, by lowering taxes on the consumer themselves, they can buy more goods. By hiring more people, they also pay taxes within the economy, and therefore you have an overall positive effect on the economy. The Laffer Curve. This is why Republicans discourage high taxes or a severely progressive tax rate on the wealthy. And the way I'm going to try to draw this, I know it might come out looking a little bit odd, but I'll do my best. The way essentially that Republicans view it in the Laffer Curve, it states that the higher taxes can eventually lead to lower output or lower tax revenues. What it's saying is, I'm going to work a lot, and this is my taxes, until you tax me too much, and then I'm going to start working less and less and less. And this is output right here, or amount, or income maybe you could call it. And then over here is my tax rate. Another good way to look at this is that if you continually tax me and tax me and tax me, and I'm going on up and up and up my income, as you tax me more and more and more, I might as well work less and less and less and get the same real income. Remember, real income is what we look at in the economy. This is our purchasing power. This is what matters to the consumer. A budget deficit, pretty self-explanatory. That's the amount by which government spending exceeds revenue in a given year. We have operated on a budget deficit for quite some time. We've only had a couple budget surpluses that were truthfully not very significant in the last 70 years. When we have a budget deficit, we have to borrow to pay our bills. That's a whole nother lecture, but essentially the debt limit just keeps getting raising, and that was why we had the debt ceiling debate, and we continually have it, is because we operate with a budget deficit. A budget surplus would be the opposite. It's the amount by which government revenues exceed government expenditures in a given year. This is just showing you how automatic stabilizers would work in the economy. I recommend you reading this. It's just showing you how social programs could possibly lower the impact of a shock in the economy, an adverse shock in which GDP falls. Automatic stabilizers, these are things that have already been passed, and what they try to do is stabilize the economy when we're experiencing a fall in GDP. The problem is they don't typically work great, and sometimes we do need to take, or it's argued whether we need to take, but Congress does take action, i.e. stimulus plans and bailouts. Those are not within automatic stabilizers. So our deficit is bad. Yes and no. No, if the stabilizers work, which I feel like they work as long as we don't depend on them consistently. If we do, then we have things like long-term unemployment and, unfortunately, less incentive to get off of unemployment insurance and social programs. So yes and no. No, if they actually work, and it's more appealing to get off of the social program than to stay on it. Yes, it's completely bad when it comes to crowding out. And crowding out, if you'll recall, is when investments leave the nation because we have a gross, exaggerated spending in GDP. Therefore, what I mean is such an increase in GDP that we're borrowing money and our dollar is starting to go down, and it's more attractive to invest overseas. This is just a simple history throughout the U.S. Before the 1930s, we didn't have a very active role in expansionary programs. Around 1930, both Hayek, Frederick A. Hayek, or H.A. Hayek, he and John Maynard Keynes became forefront, and John Maynard Keynes developed the Keynesian policy, which I talked about the last lecture, and one was arguing for more government intervention, which led to the way that we look at monetary and fiscal policy today. The other, F.A. Hayek, he essentially said that we need to let the economy fix itself. So those were the two ideas, the big things in economics that started around the 1930s. I'm going to release a video that's pretty interesting. It's well done about Hayek and Keynes. In the Kennedy administration, that's when we started to really vamp up the social programs, and unfortunately, as we vamped up and increased government spending, we also did not account for the growing budget deficit, and therefore we started borrowing money upon itself and started going further and further in debt. And then during the Vietnam era, we had a substantial amount of debt. And permanent income is something that we use to estimate households' long-run average level income. This lets us look at it over a long period of time, and what we try to do with that is just look at it from the standpoint of, if your income doesn't change very much, do we want to enact tax policies that continually rise over the next 30, 40 years that would really impact your real level of income? Then came the Reagan administration, tax cuts enacted during 1981. The great thing about this was that we saw these tax cuts, but also a decrease in total government spending. This kind of shows you George W. Bush and Clinton and how we had expenditures and revenues. We had a surplus at the very end of Clinton's administration and the first of Bush's administration. Unfortunately, we had some great recessions during the Bush campaign. Now, I don't want you to get from this that Clinton was good and Bush was bad as far as economic policy goes, because the global recession should not be compared to the same as the 1990s technology boom. It's like I said before, it's very difficult to compare two time periods in economics. I will say that Newt Gingrich's policies during the Clinton administration were very lucrative to business owners and resembled those more of Reagan. And I would also add that George W. Bush was very pro-spending, which is typically not the policy of the Republican Party. All right, here are your key terms. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. As always, you can email me at jkemper@southplainscollege.edu. You can also contact me via Twitter at Mr. Kemper.